So we're going to try an experiment this morning and hope that it works. May the words of our lips and the meditations of all our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So, I am not a gardener, not if I can help it. The flower beds outside my house are a Darwinian experiment. Sometimes I will put perennials in there and then just you guys fight it out here and I'll be inside. So if I ever need to do any tending or planting or pruning, there is not much joy in it and there's no love behind it. And that leaves me, I think, entirely unqualified to speak about where the good news is to be found in this passage where Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. So I am very happy to be in conversation today with Simon Jacques, someone for whom planting and tending and pruning and growing is a part of their vocation and their chosen work. So Simon, can you tell us a little bit about your life as a farmer and your time as a tender and grower and a pruner of vines?
Hello, sure. Many years ago, when I was just getting into the world of farming, I spent the part of 2 seasons working at D'Angelo Estate Winery, a beautiful vineyard on the shores of Lake Erie in Essex County. And one of my main jobs there was pruning the grapevines in the spring. Since then, I started my own farm and also worked for EcoCert, and in that role, I inspected many of Ontario's organic wineries and got to know many of the dedicated vine growers who grow grapes in Ontario.
Thank you. So, and thank you for bringing that experience and that care for growing and fruitfulness into our worship this morning. Can you say a little bit about why pruning is necessary? To me, a non-gardener, it feels very violent. Why is pruning necessary, and what would grapevines do if they were just left to their own devices?
Grapevines are perennials, and that means that unlike annual crops who know they're going to die and put all of their energy into making seed, grapevines are in it for the long haul. They have a strategy of growing big and staying alive at the expense of making seeds. So from the moment that a little grape seedling sprouts in the edge of the forest, it has to grow tall and fast. In fact, it can't even make grapes in the first 2 or 3 years of its life. It puts everything it has into growing tall, reaching up, climbing trees to try and make sure it gets a place in the sun. And that's a strategy that works well in the wild. But when we plant them into a vineyard, it's a strategy that doesn't work as well. The vine grower wants big, tasty grapes, and the grape still worries that it's in its competitive forest environment. It keeps trying to grow, and it doesn't want to make grapes, and the vine grower just gently coaxes it to put more of its energy into fruit and less into growing big. In nature, there's no free lunch. Energy that it puts into growing is energy that it doesn't have for growing fruit. In the vineyard, every vine has its little space, and the vine grower ensures that all the grapes will have all their needs met. They don't need to worry about competition. Sometimes they're a bit like kindergarten teachers telling all the kids to share and play nicely together, and they would only stop fighting each other. They could work together and make a whole lot of really nice fruit.
I sometimes think God, as a kindergarten teacher, is a really powerful image.
Yeah.
But I love how that echoes with the 23rd Psalm from last week, with the still waters and the green pastures and not wanting, that idea that we're provided with all we need. And a theology of enoughness, right? Just enough. That says that we don't need to outcompete one another. And so many of our human systems are about climbing the highest, and specifically about climbing high in ways that keep others down. And feels like a lot of the time, Jesus keeps inviting us into another way with enough for all of us. And if we could just trust in the abundance of earth and sun and rain and trust in the goodness of the vine grower, instead of feeling like we can only trust in our own desperate striving. Are there other ways that you see in which either individual humans or sort of the collective humanity is like the branches of a vine? And what does that feel like for you to hear yourself compared to a branch?
Oh, well, it resonated with me. I thought that's such a rich metaphor. I'm so much like the branch. I've spent so much energy reaching out for that sparkling ray of sunlight that's just out of reach, just up there, or climbing the sycamore so I can be taller than the tallest tree and see what's ahead and be on top of the world. And sometimes I would even pray to God and say, help me get these things, because if I get them, I'll be able to do so much good and everything will be wonderful. And other times, if I'm quiet, I think I can hear God answering and saying, I see that you want these things. And don't worry, I gave you these desires. They're good. And they got you to where you are now, but now you're ready for the next lesson. And that is this, that sometimes if you want to reach your full potential, to keep growing, you need to stop growing, stop reaching and striving and pull back and look inward instead of outward. Like, what am I reaching for when I'm reaching out for that sparkling sunbeam? Or when I climb the tree, what am I looking for? I'm looking for God. I think God says, yeah, you can find me up there. You'll find me in that beautiful sunbeam, but you'll also find me right here, right now. You don't have to do all that work, reaching and striving. I'm right here in your own living room. You don't need to move and go and do anything. You can stay right here. Yeah.
How timely. I love that, though. And there's echoes there, I think, of John's epistle about the difference between love and fear, and how the vine grower isn't punishing the vine for being itself. It's just that the promise of fruit is so good that it is worth some pruning to achieve it. And for me, that echoes Paul too, that all things are lawful for me, but not all things are beneficial. And there's nothing but love here, love for the fruitful branch and love for the unfruitful branch. And then that piece about burning starts to feel maybe less like a threat and more like cleaning. God saying, hey, if you grew off in a fruitless direction, that's behind you now, and you can put your energy into growing good fruit. And then it becomes about forgiveness and about restoration and about having all of our energy focused on what's next and what's coming and what's possible, rather than sort of looking behind at all the litter of branches back there. And I also wonder, though, about if people read this and see themselves in the cut off branches. Because of a course that I'm taking right now, I did a series of interviews in the last few weeks with people who've left their childhood churches and would now describe themselves as having no religion. And there was a lot of sadness about it and anger, and a lot of people who were hurt by the church, or people who didn't have a childhood faith to begin with and feel like they're now cut off from Jesus because of that. Is burning the only option for a branch that has been cut?
Absolutely not. Yeah, and I like what none of the vine growers that I met go through their vines thinking that they need to punish the branches that aren't doing what they want. growers I know approach pruning as an act of love and care. They're trying to coax the vine into exploring a different aspect of its potential. But there are other options for the cutoff branch. And to get to that, I'm going to jump right into a parable. It's a specific story, but it's really, I think, it can be a metaphor for human culture as a whole and how our continuous struggle to grow and expand at any cost almost destroyed everything. So I'll try and keep it brief. So we're going to go to France, mid-1800s. There was a young vine grower living with his family on a vineyard that had been in their family for generations. Some of the vines in there were 200 years old, and it was a beautiful vineyard, but it wasn't getting any bigger. It was surrounded by other vineyards. In fact, all the land in the valley had been turned into vineyards. And this young vine grower, he was working with his father and maybe his older brother. He was going to have to share this space. And he had big dreams. He wanted to expand and see the world. And one day he announced to his father, I'm going to move to North America and start my own vineyard. I hear they're giving away land there. I can make a vineyard that's 3 times the size of this one. And so with his father's blessing, he dug up a handful of their best vines and sailed to Florida. And he got there and he got his piece of land and he planted his vineyard, and much to his dismay, within a year, the vines all started dying. And he didn't understand it. It was good soil. He knew how to take care of vines. He used all the tricks he knew about caring for sick vines. Nothing worked. He did notice that on the edge of the field there were wild grapes. They seemed to be growing fine, so he planted a few of them in his vineyard. And they grew fine, but the grapes were kind of sour and they made a musty, funky wine that nobody liked. So in failure and desperation, he dug up the surviving vines, sailed back to France, and put those vines back into the family vineyard. And as you can imagine, that didn't work out well for him. Again, almost right away, all the vines in the family vineyard started dying. And in fact, the vines in the vineyards all around him started dying. And this is now mid-1800s. Within about 10 years, this plague had spread to Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal. And by some estimates, something like maybe even 90% of the vines in Europe either died or were damaged in this plague. Now, with the clarity of hindsight, and especially now, we all know what they should have done at this point, and that would have been to self-isolate, impose travel restrictions, but that is not what happened. A vine grower in Italy saw the plague surrounding his vineyard and said, I better get out of here. I've got a brother in New South Wales. I'm going to go there and start a vineyard. And so he dug up his vines and sailed to Sydney, and all the vines in Eastern Australia died. And the same story played out in South Africa, Argentina, California. The problem, it turned out, was a soil-borne aphid called phylloxera. And the solution was grafting. As I mentioned before, the North American grapevines had evolved with phylloxera. This aphid was native to Eastern North America. The Eastern North American grapes had evolved with them for millennia. They were resistant. They just made crappy wine. Then someone discovered that you could graft the beautiful Cabernet, so you could cut off a branch from your best Cabernet Sauvignon grapevine, stick it onto the roots of a North American grape, and you'll have a plant that produces delicious grapes that make great wine and can withstand the disease of phylloxera. So it turns out that sometimes the branch that gets cut off, sometimes when you cut off a branch and graft it back onto roots, you can end up with a plant that's even stronger and more resilient than it was to begin with.
I love everything about this story. There's so much more to it than we can get into now, and I encourage everybody to look up in wherever your favorite places are to learn new things about the Great French Wine Blight and find out more about this amazing story of a global pandemic fueled by an unregulated desire for profit and made worse by national pride, a commitment to ideological positions over emerging evidence. There's a piece in that story where people were saying, no, that can't possibly be the cause of disease, and so they didn't do anything about the insects. And a story where there's still no cure, but there is a robust and ongoing abundance that is born out of a diversity of innate resilience and abundant life despite the ongoing presence of the forces of death. So, nope, nothing for us to learn or see here. Has the agricultural world learned anything from that experience? Is there hope in that story for us now?
Yes, they learned. To this day now, almost everywhere in the world, all of the great European wines, whether it's in California, France, Germany, Australia, are grafted onto North American rootstock. And that is the norm for agricultural practice today. There are a few parts of the world where this disease hasn't reached, and those areas are very careful now to make sure no vines get brought in. But it certainly has a lot to say to us now, especially in this time when so many are feeling cut off, either from the church, we're cut off from our families, from our jobs maybe. And I think the promise of that story is that there is hope that even after being cut off, we can grow back stronger than we ever were before.
Thank you. And that idea of grafting keeps coming back, that which has been cut off can be reattached in a way that is entirely fruitful, that is, I don't know, don't let a French winemaker hear me say it, maybe more fruitful than would have been possible originally.
At least more resilient.
At least more okay. We'll give the French winemakers the superiority of the fruit. All right. But I love that. I love that image of a God who is pruning and grafting and coaxing the whole thing towards fruitfulness and creating new life where it seemed that only death was possible. Anything to add to that?
I think that's it.
Well, thank you for this conversation. When I don't know how to end things, I usually just say, thanks be to God.
Amen.
Amen.